This is the Comics Alternative, episode 130, reviews of The Age of Selfishness, Lumberjanes, Volume 1, and Castaways, Number 1.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode of the podcast, we're going to be looking at three new titles. First, Andy and I are going to be looking at the new work by Darryl Cunningham, The Age of Selfishness, Ayn Rand, Morality, and the Financial Crisis. Then we're going to look at the first trade from Noelle Stevenson, Grace Ellis, and Brooke Allen, Lumberjanes, Volume 1. And then after that, we're going to look at the first issue of Matt Kindt and Scott Kolins' Castaways. But before we get to those discussions, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that the discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you'll find incredible specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but many times the discounts are larger than that.
That's right, and normally we talk about bundle madness, but this month DCB Service is going bundle crazy.
Bundle crazy!
They've got bundles for the new. You can get 22 of the new Archie #1 covers for 50% off from Archie.
Yeah.
The Archie Dark Circle bundle. There are multiple DC bundles for 45, 55, and 65% off.
Jeez, crazy!
I know, and I can't even. It doesn't stop there. All the Marvel Secret Wars books are 50% off. That's still $102. But and then their usual Vertigo, Valiant bundles where you get multiple books by the same publisher for a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those books individually. So go check it out. It's crazy.
Geez, Andy, it is crazy. But you know what? Sometimes crazy is good, especially when that crazy is at Discount Comic Book Service. So go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your crazy comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do pre-order there, please be sure to drop them a line and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Wow, a lot of craziness. They just keep getting more and more specials every month.
Yeah.
And the wonderful thing about having them as a sponsor is that we don't have to blow smoke just for a few bucks every week, because we actually do use Discount Comic Book Service, so we can attest to the great discounts that they have.
That's true.
Yeah. So how have things been with you, Andy?
Busy. Semester's wrapping up. I guess when this airs on Wednesday, we'll be 2 days away from the Sumter Comics Show. So any of our listeners who are in the South Carolina region and might want to check out this Saturday in Sumter, South Carolina from 12 to 9 at Patriot Hall. Big comic show.
That's right. We put up a link to that in last week's show notes.
Great.
So if you're in that area, check it out. Plus, it's free.
Yeah.
You can't beat free.
No.
Yeah, this has been a very busy month, and we're just wrapping up the first week of April. In fact, as you and I, over the past couple of days, have been going through a tentative schedule for the shows we have planned for this month, it's just dawned on me today, how much I have going on, the podcast and otherwise. So I don't know. I feel like this time of the year, it's almost like a mad dash to get to an end point, but I don't even know what that end point is.
Yep.
So, but there's a lot to do, and also there's a lot to discuss on this week's show. So let's go ahead and get into the comics.
Yep, let's do it.
The first book we're going to discuss is a new one from Abrams Comic Arts, and it is Darryl Cunningham's The Age of Selfishness, Ayn Rand, Morality, and the Financial Crisis. And Andy, this is one that when it was solicited a few months ago, you and I pointed this out as a book we may want to look at in a future episode, and here we are, discussing the book.
That's right. I was looking forward to this, and when we got our review copies, I dived right in.
Now, I know that you're an Ayn Rand fanatic, that she has informed your life. So I want to step lightly in our discussion on this, because I wouldn't want you to have, I don't know, some kind of psychotic moment where you fly into a rage, but...
Well, I don't. Why would I fly into a rage? Because this book's critical of Ayn Rand. Well, big deal. Yeah. It's a comic book, and Ayn Rand is winning right now. Anyway, so
yeah, and and that's one of the things that is, I guess, probably most distressing about Cunningham's work, and that is he points out that the attitudes that more or less define her philosophy have not only been gaining traction over the past few decades, but, as you put it, winning out.
Yeah. That they are some of the dominant political and economic philosophies right now.
Right. And, maybe one way of approaching this book is for us to discuss, before we read this, what we thought it would be going into it, and then after having read it, how the experience of reading this may or may not have aligned with what we thought the book might be. So when you saw this solicited a few months ago, how did you think Cunningham would present his narrative?
That's a good question. I don't know. I guess I assumed that it would deal with explaining what Ayn Rand's philosophy, and then tell the story of the recent financial crash in the housing market and so on, and how those things connected. How about you?
I guess when I went into this, and before I started reading it, I thought that this would be a little more cohesive than it actually is. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is a book that's incohesive in the sense that it's all over the place, that it's out there, that it's scattered, because I don't think that that's necessarily the case. But the way that Cunningham organized the book, and it's in three parts. The first part is titled Ayn Rand, and as you would expect, it's basically a biography of her life, in brief. And then the second section is called The Crash, and this deals with the recent, back in 2008, financial crisis that we had, and not just in the U.S., but worldwide. And then the last part basically pulls back for, let's say, a long-shot view, and that is The Age of Selfishness. So it takes some of the stuff that we had in the Ayn Rand biography section, that first part, some of the specifics of the crash, and kind of applies it in a larger, I guess a broader, more philosophical manner. But, I mean, the entire book is philosophical to one point or another. So I don't want to suggest that it's in that last part that we get kind of a larger overarching philosophy. So it is structured in that three-part manner. Mm-hmm. What I was a little surprised by in reading this, and overall I like the book, I was wondering why Ayn Rand wasn't woven more tightly throughout the book as a whole in the second and third sections. Now, every now and again, Cunningham will draw our attention back to something that he mentioned earlier about, the way that Ayn Rand, either her philosophy or maybe aspects of her personal life, her interactions with the people in her life, how this, finds expression in something that happened, with the financial crisis, or, certain attitudes by political philosophers, in contemporary times. But I think that those references to Rand are relatively few and far between in the second and third sections. So I guess I thought that this would be more about her throughout, and it both is and isn't, is my final assessment.
Okay. I think when I talked about expectations, I feel like the first two sections made sense in relationship to my expectations, in that, you go from Ayn Rand's biography to the financial crash, and the link between those two may be less Ayn Rand herself than Alan Greenspan, who's her disciple, and then basically one of the architects of the American economy in the last 20, 30 years, and therefore one of the people who Cunningham hangs a lot of responsibility on for the financial crash. Mm-hmm. And then the third section gets into, as you mentioned, is almost more of an essay on politics, on the influence of Rand on conservative politics, mm-hmm. and draws on a lot of research, basically, about how conservatives and progressives develop their political philosophies throughout their lives, how these things are reflected in kind of daily choices that people make, and so on.
Yeah, even talking about biological and psychological research that's been done. Right. Yeah, and in fact, in the back of the book, Cunningham does provide a variety of different sources, section by section. So part 1, we have a list of the sources that he referenced, part 2, part 3. So, if you're wondering where did the author get this information, well, just turn to the back of the book. And there's even a useful glossary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is really helpful because, one of the things I was interested in about reading this book too is that I don't know, about more than a year ago now, I read now I can't remember the author's name. I read The Big Short by Michael Lewis. Yeah, Michael Lewis is The Big Short, and was really fascinated by it. In fact, I like Michael Lewis in general. I like Flash Boys is also a fascinating look at economic markets, and I have no knowledge or otherwise outside of those books thought I had any interest in that sort of thing. But Lewis is such a good reporter of these really, really complex systems and explaining them, mm-hmm. that I really appreciate it. And The Big Short, kind of was maddening to me because of, he follows the people who kind of were aware that the housing bubble was going to burst and that these credit default swaps were really dangerous. And so, having read that and then having gotten into this book, and yet I still feel like I need to, every once in a while I'm reading this, look up to figure out what something, look up in the back to see what something is, what was
like a CDO, collateralized debt obligation, things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I had the same experience because I guess it was a little more than 2.5 years ago that I read The Big Short because I was using it in a classroom. It was like what Cunningham's doing in that second part of The Age of Selfishness, but in a much more detailed, close-up manner where he does follow individuals.
Yeah.
And you get to see some of the insights, much more inside stuff than we get with the broader picture that Cunningham paints in the second part.
Yeah.
And I getting back to The Age of Selfishness, though, I'm wondering if perhaps this book may have been trying to do too many things at once. I mean, I understand where Cunningham is going in trying to link Ayn Rand's philosophy to what was going on in, let's say, the late 20th, early 21st century American and world politics and finance, and then looking at larger issues, like you mentioned, some of the psychology, the biology, the studies that have been done in terms of what makes a conservative and their attitudes, what makes a liberal and their attitudes, and all of that. I mean, I think he does a pretty good job of pulling all of this together, but I don't know. I just feel that, that first part it's Ayn Rand, and if we had gotten a fuller biography of Ayn Rand, like we used to get with those Pantheon books that introduced like a biography of Darwin or Marx or Nietzsche, Freud, people like that, it reminded me somewhat of those books. And then in that second part, we had almost another project entirely in terms of a comics overview of the financial crisis. And then in the third part, almost a completely different project. Now, again, I think Cunningham did weave them together enough, but in reading this, I just wondered if, maybe deal with just one and really focus on that and flesh that part out and not try to do the three different things that he's doing in this book.
Oh, I don't know if I got the sense that Cunningham was overreaching or anything. I do. If I had to pick a section that I didn't like as much as the others, it would be that third section, and that's the point in which I think Cunningham has moved largely away from narrative and is dealing with a kind of essay about politics and the Age of Selfishness. But I think that we get as much. I don't feel like there was questions about Ayn Rand's life that I was left wondering about. I mean, I think it gives the basics of her life and how her life was, how her experiences both informed and in a lot of ways contradict her philosophy. And then the narrative of the crash itself is again makes sense, and I think the connections between Rand's philosophy and the crash are made pretty clear. So I don't get the sense that in I felt like any of these sections were necessarily underdeveloped or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't want to suggest that these were underdeveloped. I don't think that's the same thing as saying that one of these, or maybe even two taken together at the exclusion of a third, and I think the third would be that last part that you mentioned, couldn't have been developed more. In other words, use more of that page space by taking out, let's say, the last section. Because I'm with you on this last section. That seemed to be not necessarily the odd man out, but different in tone, to where this does become something that is much more of an opinionated essay. Now, where he's going with this, I'm right there with him. It resonated with me, but it just struck me as standing out. And in fact, I think as much as Cunningham tried to be even-handed in, being not necessarily being critical, but giving an analysis or a critique, let's say, of both the conservative mindset and the liberal mindset. I mean, you can tell which side he tends to fall on.
Yeah, if he is trying a little bit to be even-handed in the end by showing that both the conservative and the progressive mindsets have downsides as well as upsides. But, for the rest of the book, it is it is pretty clear where he falls. Right. It is not left up to the reader to think, to decide in a sense. I mean, it is up to the reader to decide, but Cunningham makes it very, very clear that he thinks that there are people who should be in jail for what happened in the financial crisis, and that and that very little has been done to fix the problems and prevent this from happening again.
Mm-hmm.
And also, and I think getting in the Rand section, I think Cunningham does also spend some time pointing out Rand's own hypocrisy in her life and the way in which she she was pretty tyrannical with the way people were, how she did depend on others' charity or whatever in her life, and so on, and that that she was rarely consistent in her philosophy, but that can be true for most people, I would think, except Rand's philosophies had way more influence than, say, yours or mine do.
Exactly. And also, I mean, with Rand, unlike other philosophers or critical thinkers, I don't know if we want to call her a philosopher, perhaps, I mean, her beliefs were so draconian, right? And so, at least on paper, so to speak, they didn't allow for much wiggle room or gray space. It seemed to be that her philosophy was more, it is or it isn't.
Sure.
You are a taker, or or otherwise. And so, I think holding her up to the inconsistencies and the hypocrisies just makes sense. I don't know if I enjoyed the first part or the second part the most of the three parts of this book. But I don't know, I would have liked a little more about her, and if had this been just a biography of her life, maybe going into more detail, and maybe even showing her a little more sympathy than we get. It may have had to have been forced sympathy, I don't know, but I mean, that would have been fine as well. But I like the second part. I think that Cunningham did a good job of explaining, in a kind of a broader sense, what was going on that led up to the crash. Every now and again, bringing in Ayn Rand, almost incidentally at places. But now, let me ask you, what did you think of the art? Because Darryl Cunningham does not only the writing but the art.
Yeah, it's a really interesting abstract style that Cunningham uses. I mean, he has a kind of fairly consistent caricature of Ayn Rand herself that is often just a kind of square head with a lock of hair falling down on one side, and then in close up an even more detailed caricature of Rand, but otherwise the characters, especially in that first part, are drawn with barely any details at all, and yet we're able to keep track of the different people, like Nathaniel Brandon and his wife and so on. So that even if they're just their faces are just maybe 3 lines and some
two-dimensional,
hair, that we still know who he's drawing, and then other character or other figures like Alan Greenspan and so on get a little bit more detail, so we know who he is. And then in the second part, historical figures like Reagan and Clinton and so on are also recognizable. But otherwise, it's a pretty simple, cartoonish style that I think works for conveying what are really complex ideas.
Yeah. Speaking of Alan Greenspan, it looks like he's always in need of a shave.
Yeah, or in the middle of a poop.
Oh, God. Okay, I hadn't thought about that, but now when I go back and look at this, I'll think Alan Greenspan pooping. Somewhat, and there's a place for this style of illustration because by far Cunningham's not the only one to draw like this, but it's the kind of art that someone looking at this, especially with no interest or background in reading comics, will kind of easily make fun of. They'll say something to the effect of, "Oh, this is what my daughter draws," or "This is what my nephews have drawn when they come over," because it is a very childlike, simple, flat kind of illustration style. And you're right; in places it does get detailed, but for the most part, it's the same kind of simple flatness. Although you were mentioning about the detail of Ayn Rand. If you look at the cover, and we have variations of this kind of dark, large-eyed, almost foreboding Ayn Rand.
Yeah.
And we see her every now and again like this. In fact, I just turned to 2 pages that we have this as an example. One on page 7, where we have not only a close-up of her head, but a very close close-up of her eyes. And then another on page 42. And there is something damn spooky about the way that he draws Ayn Rand in that style. It's those eyes, and it's like something out of a horror film. I mean, I expect to hear Boris Karloff narrating in the background. It can get really disturbing, and I think that works to great effect, especially in that first part of the book when we get her biography, to show this what I find is a disturbing image, which underscores the disturbing aspect of her philosophy. Yeah.
Soulless. I think that is probably yet another aspect of Cunningham's art where he's not, he's not covering up how he feels about Rand and her life and her philosophy. It isn't just in the words he chooses and the pointed comments he makes, but the way he draws her as well. And that's a recognizable image of Rand as well. I mean, we've seen similar things. Her photos look like that.
Mm-hmm. And you contrast that with the way that she's depicted, for example, on page 60, because we have a similar hairstyle, but we have a very different look, especially with her eyes. I mean, she looks more like every other character on page 60, as opposed to, the aforementioned page 7, where, you do have an image very much like the one you find on the cover, this kind of haunting blankness, almost as if she's looking off into space, like beyond you, in a way that gives me the willies.
Yeah. Have you read any Ayn Rand in your life?
I have not.
Okay. It was like when I was like 18, I was really into the Fountainhead.
Because see, that's what I keep hearing, that when people read her works, usually it's young high school or college kids, and they're really taken by her. They think that she's deep, and then they grow out of it.
Yeah, or they become Paul Ryan. But
Paul Ryan. Yeah.
And I think that was it. I think that what it satisfied for me was a couple things. One, this very rigid moral binary, so that it didn't cause any there's no no doubt, no room for interpretation or anything like that. And also the feeling of of Howard Rourke being this misunderstood great man who fights the system. And it's like, yeah, the system sucks. And so that fed that kind of 18-year-old rebellion, not only rebelliousness, but sense of that the world really didn't appreciate and understand me the way it should.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I don't have regrets because I didn't necessarily make a whole lot of decisions in my life based on Rand's philosophy, but
unlike Paul Ryan.
But I look, or Ron Paul, and naming his child after her. But I did, but I do look back and feel kind of bemused about that teenage self who it's so clear as to why he would be wrapped up in that idea. Now, out of sheer laziness, I never read Atlas Shrugged. Because I took one look at that book and said, that's 1,000 pages. I'm never getting that part of my life back. So I'm thankful for that.
But did you read Lord of the Rings trilogy?
No. Also, no, don't have enough time.
Okay, because I mean that is together longer than Atlas Shrugged. So.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of people at that age, like me, read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
But that's got more grayness and ambiguity in it.
For some weird reason, I read the Herman Wouk Winds of War and War and Remembrance books. I don't know if you remember those big event TV miniseries.
Oh, I remember the miniseries, yeah.
When they were on. Those books were both around 1,000 pages. For some reason, I read those when I was like 16. What a ridiculous kid.
God, what a dope. And you didn't have to read it for class?
No, and I'm riding the school bus reading this massive frickin' World War II novel. I don't know. What's wrong with that guy? I want to go back in time and slap him a couple times. Say, you know what? You could be reading better 1,000-page novels right now.
God, read Moby Dick.
I mean, I did that, but
as a kid?
Yeah.
You read Moby Dick as a kid?
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna get off on a tangent here.
Oh, I'm sorry, bro. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have gone off on a tangent.
That's okay. My dad was a cabinet maker. And one of the first things he built was bookshelves, and he never had anything. He didn't actually have a lot of books to put on the bookshelves. I think he had kept copies in college of Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner and Hunter S. Thompson's Hell's Angels book, and that was really about it. For books that we had in the house. And so he built these bookshelves and had to fill them with something, so he bought all those like kind of Harvard Classics sets and the Library of American Classics and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so those were just always on the shelves from when I was 6 years old. I looked at those and thought, one day I'm going to read these. So I started with Poe and then kind of worked my way through some of the classics. I didn't read all of them, but I was pretty young when I read Moby Dick.
Well, that's cool.
Didn't understand it. Like, I couldn't have... 10 days later, I couldn't have told you anything about it. But
well, adults read it, and they don't understand it. So.
I looked at the words and recognized most of them.
And the cetology chapter didn't put you to sleep?
No, yeah, I'm sure it did. I didn't skip it.
Oh, well, good for you.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, back to Ayn Rand and the Age of Selfishness. Now, along with this, I wanted to ask you: did you read the book of the guy who did the introduction to the Age of Selfishness, Michael Goodwin? Did you read his book that came out a few years ago, Economics?
I have it, but I haven't read it. Did you read it?
I'm almost through it. I hadn't read it, and like you, I had it. In fact, I think we got this from Abrams like 2.5 years ago, around the time that we started the podcast.
Yeah, really early. I remember getting it.
Yeah, but I didn't read this until I read Age of Selfishness, and I thought, I'm gonna read this to see what Goodwin has to say, and I really like economics. Now he uses, Goodwin does the writing, but the art is by someone whose work we admire, Dan Burr. Kings in Disguise and On the Ropes.
Oh yeah.
But and so it has I think a more appealing look to it. I think the art, Burr's art, is very attractive, and I think it goes a long way of making the exposition palatable. And because reading economics, I couldn't help but think of Understanding Comics. I mean, it's very similar in style because there is a Goodwin character who tells the story, and he becomes a personality. And every now and again, he'll pop in, and then he'll pop out, or he'll narrate. From absence from the panel. But again, his presence is very much like McCloud's persona's presence in Understanding Comics. You have something different going on with Cunningham, and I just bring up Goodwin not to say that it's a better book or is not as good, but just as a point of comparison because he did the introduction for this. But both of them are dealing with financial issues and financial topics. And Economics also came out not too long after the big crash of 2008. So it's another one to definitely check out. If you like The Age of Selfishness. So I think that they work really well together. Although, getting back to Cunningham's politics and his philosophy, it is much clearer in Age of Selfishness. I think that Goodwin is able to bring a more detached, if you want to call it objective, overview to his historical overview. But and Cunningham, but I don't think there's anything wrong with his opinion coming out in the various sections.
No, and I think it's apparent early on that's what's going on. Mm-hmm. So, in fact, I don't have a problem with it either.
In fact, the only time I do have a problem with it is when he is trying a little too hard to be even-sided, like in that last part where he says, but liberals have problems too. And it's almost as if he's reaching for it to try to find problems with liberal philosophy from his point of view. It's like he's straining for examples, and they seemed forced. But other than that, though, I mean, I had no problem with the editorializing that's going on in the book. Right.
But yeah, anybody going into it should know that this is while there are some narrative elements, this is really an essay, and it's an essay that's making an argument, and Cunningham is accumulating, evidence throughout to make this argument, and so I think though anybody that is even interested in but remotely confused by the recent financial crisis can take a look at this book and get a good handle on what are really some pretty complex issues that Cunningham really ably addresses and makes clear.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Anything else on the Age of Selfishness before we move on?
I don't think so.
Okay. Well, let's look now at volume number 1 of Lumberjanes. Now, this is written by Noelle Stevenson and Grace Ellis, and the art is by Brooke Allen. Now, before this trade, had you read any Lumberjane comics?
I had. I think it was over Christmas time that Comixology had made Lumberjanes number 1 available for I think a day or so. So I picked that up there and I read issue number 1. But that was it.
Okay.
How about you?
No, before this first trade, I hadn't read any Lumberjanes. I was very much aware of it because so many people kept telling me that this was one of their favorite titles. Mm-hmm. And more times than not, I would get this when I would go to my local shop, Collected in Plano. Several people there, customers as well as employees, would say, "Oh, we love this. It's one of my favorites right now." And I remember that several months ago when you and I mentioned this on a preview show, it was solicited. I think you made a point. You said this is something. I can't remember if you made it on the recording or off air, so to speak. You mentioned something about, I'd be interested in looking at this when it comes out, and now we're doing that.
Yeah, I think one of the things I said on the show is that I feel like we can't possibly read everything that comes out, or even at this point in the world of comics, read everything that's good.
Yeah,
but I felt kind of negligent about not having covered Lumberjanes because it was getting such strong positive responses pretty much across the board.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, because of all of the positive responses that it has been getting, did that influence your take on this first volume after having read it?
Well, I went into it, I guess with positive feelings. I didn't go into it like, okay, you're getting all the love, show me what you got, and with a kind of cynicism or measured response. Pretty much right away it hits the ground, and it is just a fun and endearing comic. Again, almost pretty much from page one. And I really enjoyed reading this.
Well, the reason I asked what your response was, especially given all of the positive response that others have given it, is there have been a number of occasions where someone tells me, "Oh, you have to read this title. It's great." And it's got nothing but good press. And so I go into it with an open mind, but with high expectation. And then when I read it, and it could still be good, but my response is, well, it's good, but it's not as good as I thought it would be. And so it's almost as if all of the praise that preceded my reading of the book tainted the way that I come away, or my feeling as I come away from reading it. And again, it doesn't say anything about the quality or my enjoyment. It's just I didn't like it as much as everyone else, I think, had been liking something. I didn't have that feeling with Lumberjanes. I don't think I came into this with grandiose expectations, but, I came in knowing so many people, saying that they really liked this, that it was good on a variety of different levels. And by the time I got to the end of Volume 1, I thought, yeah, okay, I can see why. I do think that it got started from the beginning, and it moved right along and kept me going. My one, I don't want to call it a criticism, but potential reservation of this first volume is I wanted it to be longer. And I know this is not the only instance where we get a trade that is made up only of 4 issues. For instance, Southern Bastards, a title that both of us love. That first volume was made up of only the first 4 issues. And so some creators will do this. The reason I was kind of wanting or thinking that maybe Lumberjanes Volume 1 could have included also issues number 5 and even 6. And in fact, I went on to read, I think, into issues 7 and 8. The storyline could have been continued and still have been containable. In other words, where they end in Volume 1, which again includes 1 through 4, where they end were at the very end of originally of issue 4 of the comic book, makes as much sense as it would if they had ended at the end of 5 of the original comic or the end of 6 of the original comic book. I think that either of those would have worked well, and also would have given us a longer Volume 1. At the same time, I'm thinking this just came out last month in March. That's almost a year since the first issue of Lumberjanes, because issue number 1 is dated April of 2014, and that's a long time to wait for a trade. And so I'm wondering why they chose not to include more issues, but who knows? Maybe I'm just Monday morning quarterbacking.
Yeah. I guess does I don't know how long the first narrative arc goes. Is it 9 issues or 8?
Well, I don't know. I've only gotten into 8, and so far it's been a continuation of the story that we have here. Now, I think that this first volume ending where it does, which is how issue number 4 of the comic book ended, with what are the boys called? Their troop. It's not Boy Scouts, but it's the equivalent. Yeah,
I can't remember what their names are.
But it ends with them, and let me turn to this because here it is. This is when their leader is speaking to them, and we find out that the boys actually turn into like wolf-like creatures or monsters, I guess.
That's right.
And their leaders say, "Don't worry, lads. You have failed me," because they didn't get the Lumberjanes. But don't worry, lads. Next time we'll be prepared. And of course, the leader's face is in this dark silhouette where you can only see the outline of his nose and one eye and the white teeth, almost like the Cheshire Cat. So, there is something ominous about the way that this ends, and it does make sense to end there. But then again, when I went on to read issue number 5 and issue number 6, I thought, well, could end there or it could end there. And maybe that speaks well to the pacing that Stevenson and Ellis have going on, in that if we as readers, or I, speaking for myself, as a reader, can't really clearly discern where one narrative arc ends and a new one begins, I kind of like that. Because sometimes it's a little too easy to see where a story begins and then ends, and then the next arc begins and ends. Maybe more continuity, more interwoven continuity is preferable, and I think we have that in Lumberjanes.
Yeah. If it ends up being a kind of ongoing series of kind of interlinked adventures, then with these girls, then that would be fun too. I would enjoy it. I'm kind of especially after reading these first few issues, I'm along for the ride wherever it goes, and I trust the creators based on the quality of this work already, that that they're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly. And this may sound kind of obvious, but in reading this, one of the things that I thought of immediately was Rat Queens.
What made you think of Rat Queens?
Well, just because of the characters and also, I guess, the intended audience for this book. Because like Rat Queens, you're dealing with a group of characters, all the protagonists, this team of all young girls. And you have something very similar going on in Rat Queens. And also like Rat Queens, and I think because the protagonists is this group of girls, this is something that appeals to readers, male and female alike. In fact, it would be interesting to know the demographics of the readership of both Lumberjanes and Rat Queens, because my guess is that these would be very similar to the demographics of a title we were discussing last week, and that is, the new revamped Batgirl.
Yeah, I think those are all interesting comparisons, because I see this. I see Rat Queens maybe as aiming at a slightly older audience than Lumberjanes does, and Batgirl is as well. But I think that you're right to kind of point out that we're seeing a lot of books that are aimed at bringing young girls and young adult women into the comics reading club. And if I were to hand say a 10, 11, 12-year-old girl a comic book right now, Lumberjanes might be the one I choose over those others, though I think they're all really, really good. But I feel like Lumberjanes, and this may be more to do with me and the kind of what Lumberjanes reminds me of is a really kind of humorous and exaggerated take on the kind of children's books that I dug into when I was a kid. The young adventures like the Hardy Boys and stuff like that, but of course with Lumberjanes they have more kind of crazy supernatural stuff happening,
right?
But just the kind of, I don't know, the kind of lessons that these characters learn there's a purity to this book that I really enjoy, and that may be what I'm kind of stumbling towards here in my explanation.
Well, I think something that you said just now really strikes it with me, and that is the fact that this is an adventure-based book. That's something that, as when we were young, one of the things that I think both of us and many young readers appreciate are fun adventures that, things happen, right? I mean, in other words, we're not going to read books that are the equivalent of, I don't know, like a Woody Allen movie, right? Where people talk about their anxieties and their relationships and whatnot. No, you're going to have weird things go on. Bam, bam, bam. One adventure happened right after another. And that's the way that Lumberjanes is structured, because you have these young girls, the Lumberjanes, going from one adventure to the next, and they can get really wild and outrageous because of the supernatural. And they don't necessarily have to make sense. Now, the more you read into the series, the more things start to come together. They're explained a little more. But even if you don't have an answer, I mean, who is the bear woman, right? In this first volume, this really isn't addressed. I think she's referenced 2-3 times. But in issues, I think it's like 5, 6, or 7, something like that, we actually do see her, and we get more of an explanation. But I don't think that that's any weak part on the first volume, because again, it's just one adventure after another. It's almost as if you're along for the ride. You're going to end. It's like being on a roller coaster, right? You're going to be okay. So just go ahead and enjoy the ups, the downs, and eventually you'll get to an end point where you can think of everything within context. So, and I think it's the adventures that kind of appeal to a younger readership, which gets back to what you mentioned a moment ago, the kind of things you read when you were younger.
And each of the girls in the Lumberjanes groups gets to shine at a different point in the adventures. One of my favorite moments is when April arm wrestles the statue that's guarding the portal or whatever, and that she chalks it up to leverage, basically, and that they're dealing with these supernatural things, but there's also a sense that what they're training, the various merit badges that they get for their accomplishments as Lumberjanes is paying off. Like, they're getting to use the skills that they learn. Or when they figure out to use the Fibonacci sequence to get across the chasm, and anagrams and so on. It's not just physical prowess that they have to exhibit, but also mental. And I can see these being great heroes and role models for young readers. Oh yeah,
a couple things that you said just now that I want to come back to. You mentioned that each character, each of the Lumberjanes, has a distinct personality. That's another thing that reminded me of Rat Queens, is that the group, the collective, has an identity, but then each individual member of that group has her own unique personality that really stands out and shines at different places in the story. And I think you have something similar going on with Rat Queens. Now, I agree with you that the readership for Rat Queens is probably going to be a little more mature, given the situations, the language, and whatnot. But maybe you could make the argument that Lumberjanes is maybe a starting point or a gateway drug, if you will, for younger readers, male and female, to then later on go and read Rat Queens when they're a little more mature. But another thing you pointed out was the Lumberjanes as role models, and the anagrams and the Fibonacci sequence, I think in particular, really stand out to me. And one of the things I'm very much aware of because of my wife Amanda is this an awareness of the lack of women in the hard sciences and mathematics.
Yeah.
Things like physics, engineering, and even things such as chemistry, maybe not so much biology, and definitely mathematics. And so from the time that our daughter Zoe was born, Mandy was just making plans to instill in her an interest in these sciences and mathematics. Now, whether that's taken or not, who knows? But at least there's that attempt. Even to this day with Zoe, and I think that it's not often that we get references to mathematics like the Fibonacci sequence, in reading material that is not exclusively, but I think to a large degree, aimed toward females, so a young female readership. So I think that this is great, and also the empowering it comes in terms of their personality, them being able to overcome adversity. You mentioned April in the arm wrestling event where she beats this statue that's much bigger than she is, and her response is it's all the leverage. So they do serve as really good role models, which brings me to something that you and I discussed over a year ago when they first started to solicit Boombox titles in previews in the Boom Studio section. This is a Boombox title, and it's right up there with, I think the one that we discussed on the show was The Midas Flesh. And I remember at the time, I felt at least hard-pressed to define an audience for Boombox, because I remember at the time thinking when they announced this, so how does Boombox differ from the regular Boom titles, and how does it differ from Kaboom? And in fact, right before we recorded, I pulled up the media release that came out in November of 2013 when they announced Boom, and there's nothing here that says anything about an age group that they're targeting of any sort. But I think after The Midas Flesh, definitely after Lumberjanes, and what are some other Boombox titles? Because I've forgotten. I had them in my head before we started recording. But
those are the two I think of automatically, so I'm not sure.
But I think that now, we can pretty fairly say that Boombox is maybe not for a readership as young as Kaboom books. And, even Kaboom books. We've talked before that Adventure Time is quite sophisticated, that adults can get a lot out of it. So it's not just for little kids. But it's for a little older demographic than Kaboom, but maybe not as old as the regular Boom Studio books. I don't know. I think it's still a little amorphous. But I think that with each new Boombox title, we get a clearer sense, and maybe that's the plan all along. They wanted to see what kind of readership they would eventually get or write for.
Well, yeah. I think that there's probably a kind of sweet spot for the readers of, that Lumberjanes would hit, squarely, and then. But, again, knowing how many of my friends and people I know who read the book who absolutely would not fit into that demographic, who are still loving it, and as you mentioned with Adventure Time, the same with those sorts of books. So it may be, maybe savvy on Boom's part that they're not putting out a press release that says, hey, 12 to 14-year-old girls, take a look at this. Yeah. that they're just making good comics, but they are good comics that you could hand to someone who is, say, a tween reader who has not maybe gotten into comics yet, and they might get hooked.
I just thought of another title that this reminds me of, and that's Princeless.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, very similar feel to it.
Yes. One of the things you said earlier that I wanted to pick up on about how Mandy is concerned, especially with the use of attracting young women into the sciences, is that this book could so easily be, hey kids, here's some math, you're gonna like it, and really kind of be heavy-handed in we're trying to make a book that is going to get young women interested in math and science because not enough are, but it is so well incorporated into the story. So even though it comes and you go, yes, a young reader's going to learn the Fibonacci sequence or learn how to do anagrams, that nonetheless there's it's incorporated into the narrative really well,
right?
And not only on top of that, there's such a celebration of knowledge and skill that they learned these things and they are applying them, and everybody's happy for one another, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right. You're right there. This is definitely not the lessons that they're introduced to doesn't stand out in the way, let's say, that they do in Dora the Explorer.
Yeah,
which I used to have to watch years ago. My God. Again, nothing wrong with Dora the Explorer, but it's just a little too overt in their lessons. And for younger viewers like that, okay, that's fine, right? But I think for the readership, younger as well as older, in Lumberjanes, more subtlety, more narrative integration is definitely called for.
Yeah.
And, one of my favorite parts of this title is What the Junk.
Yeah, What the Junk. That's what I wanted to bring that up, too, because that is... I feel like I'm going to use that from now on.
Yeah, I think we can make that the subtitle of this show. What the Junk.
Because that is a fun expression to say.
It is, because junk, with that one syllable, is close enough to the F word to where it makes sense, but it's innocent enough. It's like, like what the crap. Okay, but a little cleaner than that. What the junk.
Sure.
Plus, with that hard K ending, I think there's humor embedded in that sound.
Yep.
Because it bends. It's funny.
Yeah. This feels like what? This is crimes and misdemeanors all over again.
That's right. Okay, there's my Woody Allen reference. So yeah, definitely a title I would like to keep up with. Yeah,
it's it's a book that made me really, really happy to read, and so I enjoyed the experience of reading this quite a bit.
Yeah, I'm kind of sorry it took me almost a year to get to it.
Yeah.
So, something that didn't take us near as long to get to is the new series Castaways, because this came out just a few weeks ago. This is the #1 issue from Matt Kindt and Scott Kolins, published by Dark Horse.
Yeah, and this seems to be part of the Dark Horse initiative to attract titles that might be published by other publishers like Image, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've talked a couple times before about how certain creators like Matt Kindt, and Jeff Lemire's another, who keeps turning up at different publishing houses. They're at, with Lemire, for instance, it's Vertigo, DC Vertigo, and then Valiant, Image, Dark Horse. And Matt Kindt, I think, is very similar. He seems to be all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Kindt makes a little more sense to be sticking with Dark Horse, since Dark Horse is doing such a great job with his mind management, which is heading towards the finale.
That's right. I think that first issue of this final arc just came out this week or last week. So there's that. Yeah, but this is one, unlike Mind Management, where Kindt does both the writing and the illustration. He just does the writing on this.
Yeah.
So something very similar to what we discussed a few weeks ago with Divinity.
Yeah. And as I mentioned when we looked at the solicit for this, one of the things I like Scott Kolins' art a lot. Mm-hmm. I loved his run on The Flash with Jeff Johns, and I think he's a really good and I think really underrated action comics artist. I really like, in fact, I especially like the way he draws human figures. He doesn't have one body type that he draws, and he, generally speaking, tends to shy away from the kind of disproportionately muscular male characters and so on. Mm-hmm. So there's a clean line to his style too that I think works for this kind of adventure and science fiction comics. So I was really happy with the art when I read this.
Yeah, I think Collins' art is really good. It's spot on. And, you mentioned the comparison, or at least you made the link to Mind Management. One of the things we've discussed a few times on the show that you get in the single issues of Mind Management that you don't get, at least in the same way, in the collections, as nice as they are, is the supplementary material. Is, how on the back cover of Mind Management,
right?
You would arrange those images, arrange the covers in such a way that they created a certain image, or taken together, you'd get little clues for a larger meaning. And apparently we're going to have something similar going on with Castaways, because at the very end of this issue, they suggest as much. And at least on this issue, on the very back cover, you have a cutaway of the Castaways, I guess their base, which is an abandoned silo.
Their undersea headquarters.
Yeah, which is really cool. So if you're the kind of reader, like as a kid, you would love not only to see those cutaway sections of hidden chambers, but you created them almost like map-like of your own. I mean, this is definitely for you.
Maybe this isn't undersea. I thought their headquarters was undersea, but it says in northern Arizona, so that would not be undersea.
It could under lake.
Under lake, okay.
Because it is underwater.
Yeah. And that cutaway of the headquarters again, that hits a sweet spot for me. I used to love in superhero comics when you'd get the Legion of Superheroes headquarters and get that side view cutaway of where everything is in the headquarters, or Avengers Mansion or whatever.
Right. This is where they share meals together. This is their trophy room. This is where they poop, things of that sort.
Yeah, I don't think the Legion of Superheroes poop. In the 31st century, they've worked that out.
Yeah. Wow. So that's something to look forward to.
I'm looking forward to having a purely decorative anus.
Well, maybe that can be the subtitle of this week's show. Andy's purely decorative anus. Okay, that's getting weird. Let's get back to the comic. Okay, let me ask you now. When you read this, did you get a sense that you knew what was going on? Did you have a pretty good sense? Let's say with the first read through that you had a handle on things?
Actually, I want to respond to that with a question.
Oh.
Because one of the things I figured as I was reading this, I thought, this may be one of those books that Dark Horse does this with frequently, where there's a preview in Dark Horse Presents that I didn't read, and I was guessing, there's probably something in there. But as I went along reading the first issue for the first time, I felt like, there's probably something in a Dark Horse Presents issue that explains, for example, how these characters from the future all arrived in the present day, because as the inside front cover says, that when an unknown error sends them much further into the past than anticipated, 5 deep time explorers crash land in the Hawaiian rainforests of the primitive 21st century. Their ship destroyed and their chrono beacon shattered. The team find themselves hopelessly lost 1.2 million years in the past with no way home, and this is 1 year later. So I kind of assumed, that maybe we got the 1 year ago story in Dark Horse Presents or something. But then I never necessarily felt lost. And I'm also a sucker for the, let's put the team back together narratives. Mm-hmm. And so we've got this group of time travelers who have all gone their separate ways, and some of them actually genuinely dislike each other. Yet an event occurs in which they all have to get back together again to do a job. I'm a sucker for that narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, getting back to your question, or I guess what your question would have been is, you're going to ask me if I read. Yeah, actually, I did go back and read the short, that's about 5, maybe 6 pages of Dark Horse Presents. It's in this latest volume, Dark Horse Presents number 6. It came out back in January, and I had that issue, but I did not. I don't know. See, what happens with me in Dark Horse Presents is I get it for a while, but then I just don't get around to reading it in time. It's kind of like the times in my life that I've tried to subscribe to the New Yorker. It builds up long enough, and I feel guilty enough to where I just stop subscribing. I stop getting the issues. So I hadn't read issue number 6 yet, but it did nothing. Not knowing the small intro in Dark Horse Presents number 6 took nothing away from my reading and appreciation of Pastaways number 1. Now, when I asked you earlier if, on your first reading you had a grasp of things, I asked that because I didn't, because when I read through it, and I was going through slowly, and I thought I understood things, and I got through the first reading, and I thought, I still I don't feel like I have a grasp on what I just read. So I went back and I reread it. That time around, I felt that a little more comfortable in the narrative. And it was after that second reading that I went and fished out issue number 6 of Dark Horse Presents, and I read that 6-page prelude, and it's okay. And I'm assuming that this part from Dark Horse Presents will be in the Pastaways first trade. But I think even if it wasn't, you could definitely get into the story and pick up where things left off. Because I don't know if that Dark Horse Presents section provides much necessary information. I mean, it's nice and it's supplemental, but I don't think it is essential reading. So, I mean, they will probably include it in the trade, but if they don't, again, I don't think we're out of anything, even though they will.
One of the things I really liked in this story is the dynamics between the different characters, and how they've pretty much split up after in the year that has passed since they crash landed in the 21st century, with I guess with the exception of Herb and I can't remember the woman's name.
Ursula,
yeah. that they're together in Los Angeles, but then it's Phil. Man, I got to get these names right. Phil and Arthur, right? Who seem to have the most antagonism towards one another, and so it at one point in the story when Arthur or Phil picks up Arthur and tries to throw him into the volcano, and you're like, what's going on with these people? Mm-hmm. And we find out that that none of them can die, and they're actually actively trying to find ways to die or kill each other. Mm-hmm. And that is kind of fascinating as adding that dynamic to this team. I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and this is especially the case with Ursula, because we learn on the front cover of this first issue that there's something about. I mean, she's the one that basically holds them together psychologically and emotionally, at least when they were together. But she has a death wish, and we see this attempted 2 or 3 times in this first issue. Uh-huh. I think the one character we have here who doesn't seem as morose is Herbert, and which makes sense because he is the one who is the narrator of this. And in fact, when he's typing, basically keeping a record of everything while they're on this mission. Of course, now they're stuck, but his narration is in this pinkish box. And it's the same thing in that issue number 6 of Dark Horse Presents, that several page intro. His narration is in that pink box. So, I mean, he seems to be the one who seems, most centered.
Okay.
Of the team. It just strikes me. But I mean, this is another one of those cases like Lumberjanes where, individually each of these characters stand out, although we haven't seen them together as a team, at least in this first issue. Mm-hmm. But that's what we're going to see in the issues to come, I'm assuming, and how they work well together.
Mm-hmm. Though we do see that Art and Phil do actually kind of work pretty well together when they go to get this this lizard creature, whatever it is. Yeah. So basically, to kind of let readers know that what brings the team together is that there's things are showing up in the 21st century that don't belong there.
Exactly.
And so their job, it seems like, is going to be to collect these things so that they don't cause too much damage. Though this little dragony creature that shoots some kind of acid out its butt has already done a little damage, but he kills a douchebag, so it's not really
exactly with the hat backwards.
The hat backwards and the hang loose.
There's another anus reference you made.
Yeah, it is. Well, I just thought it was hilarious when when Phil, and they're both wearing the same costume, so it's really hard to tell the difference between those two. But when Phil captures the dragon creature by neutralizing its acid spore sac, basically by sticking his finger up its butt and then holding it
like
holding it straight up, is that's a pretty funny image. And I think in general, I really that kind of humor too, I think, was something that made me enjoy this book as well, even though there's also this kind of dark side, especially to Ursula's character, who seems to be very desperately trying to die. That there's a lot of potential for this comic.
Yeah, and in flipping through those pages that you were referencing, I came to, and I don't know what number of page this is because we're reading from a PDF. And this issue apparently has no page numbers, but this is where Art takes Phil back to the home base, and they've just arrived in that really cool-looking hovercraft. And you have at the top of this page Phil's disembodied head that's straddling two panels, and he's narrating and he's speaking. And this is something that you don't see often. I mean, there is humor in this, but at the same time, this is a hearkening back to a lot of the comics that we grew up with, right? Where we would find characters, their heads in one panel, the disembodied heads, but they're speaking, because they're the narrator there. We just don't have the voice. We have the head along with the voice. And so I thought that was neat.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if Kolins is going to be doing things like that throughout the series.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems like part of his art style, because I feel like I remember him doing that on other stuff like The Flash.
On The Flash?
Yeah. I do like too the way footnotes are done in this comic too, because that seems to be another common characteristic where something in a panel will get a red box around it, and then at the bottom of the page you get a footnote that explains what usually with futuristic weapons that are being used.
You're talking about Kindt style?
Yeah. Well, I'm not necessarily Kolins style, but just something that's added, that they make as a characteristic of this book, that the future technology that these characters use get explained in little footnotes. And the footnotes are indicated by red boxes around the technology.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking that's a characteristic that of more of Kindt than anything. Because
I wasn't saying it was. I wasn't saying that was Kolins.
Oh, I thought I heard you say Kolins, but you're right, and they even do this in that several page intro in Dark Horse Presents number 6. And in fact, it's part of the humor of that is at one point there's a little red box around a four-wheel Jeep that a woman's driving that crashes into this beacon that they're trying to retrieve. And as a footnote, that the links to that box around the Jeep, it says four-wheeled ground-based transportation that runs on fossil fuel, limited range and durability. So, I mean, there's that humor that you mentioned coming out in the story.
Yeah.
So, this is apparently going to be an ongoing, like Mind Management.
Well, Mind Management has an ending,
right? It has. Well, yeah, I mean, but every title is going to have an ending, for the most part. But Mind Management wasn't just a couple of arcs. Right. It wasn't very limited, and this looks to be something similar because they explain in the back that this is going to be. I guess it's Kindt who says this. That this is his new ongoing.
Right.
So I mean, who knows how long this will go on for? But
right. But Kindt had the ending of Mind Management planned from the beginning. He knew it was going to be about 40 issues. Whereas this may be closer to other stuff that Dark Horse is doing, like
more open-ended,
like Resurrectionists and Sundowners. Though I do wonder if if this might end up going the way of Resurrectionists and Sundowners, where we'll get the first arc in print, and then based on how well it's selling, Dark Horse may consider switching it to digital, like they did with those other two books. I don't know. I would like to see this succeed and continue going, because it's a solid adventure book. I'm a sucker for time travel stories, as well as this kind of bringing the band back together narrative. So it hits a lot of sweet spots for me, and I think Kindt hits the ground running with the characterization here. Each character is distinctive and knowable,
right?
And Kolins' art is really appropriate for this book.
I agree. It seems like we're getting quite a number of time travel comics recently.
Yeah.
Another one that just came out, and I have not read this first issue, and that is The Chrononauts.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one that Mark Millar and Sean Murphy did. Have you read that one?
No, I know a lot of people said they really liked it, and I don't know. I'm soured on Mark Millar, so if I keep hearing good things about it, I may check it out, though.
Yeah, I may have to check it out. Yeah, I want to read that. I just haven't gotten around to it yet. Too busy trying to keep up with the things we're reading for this podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there you go.
There you go.
And I'm glad I had actually ordered this so that when we decided to do it, it'd come in my latest batch of new comics. So
Which cover did you get?
I got the Matt Kindt cover.
Yeah, I did too.
I'm not sure what the other cover is, but I think the
regular cover.
Yeah.
It's Kolins.
Yeah.
And you have the four of them running. It's more of an action scene, and there's a little kind of like footnote to each of the characters, a little explanation of the kind of person that they are.
Yeah. Yes. Right.
Yeah. So I like this one, and I knew it pretty much going in that I would like it. See, Matt Kindt's one of those creators. Again, I compare him to Jeff Lemire. I never go into one of his new comics wondering, am I going to like this or not? It's almost like a foregone conclusion. I like this, even though I haven't read it yet. And I know that's not being critically fair, but I don't know. So far, Kindt has done no wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We want to be discerning, but, I can't get away from my experiences.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true of Kindt's creator-owned work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else you want to mention about Pastaways?
No.
Very good #1 issue, along with Lumberjanes Volume 1, and we started the show off with Darryl Cunningham's The Age of Selfishness. So, yeah, it's a week with a wide variety of comics.
Yep.
And if you want to read a wide variety of comics, well, go to our sponsor's website, Discount Comic Book Service. DCBService.com. You'll find a wide variety of comics and, more importantly, a wide variety of specials. You really can't beat the discounts, as Andy and I told you at the top of the show. They're the place to go. If you want books that are already out, for instance, if you want to get a copy of Lumberjanes, then you can head over to their sister company's website, InStock Trades. So InStockTrades.com, you can order a copy of Lumberjanes. But to pre-order, go to DiscountComicBookService.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. You can get in touch with us by going to the website, and in your browser, on the right-hand side of the browser, you'll see a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own browser, you can leave us a message via SpeakPipe. It's just that simple. Or if you're a difficult kind of person, you can call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And then we also have our Twitter feed where you can find new updates to our podcast as well as new content for our blog. The Twitter feed is at the #2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us on Facebook. We're also on Tumblr, and we're on Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us through Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our website, which is comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
That's right. And we do like to hear from you, whether it's via those means we just told you about or participating on our forum.
Yep.
So we want to hear from you. And until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.